right. Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. I'm Sister Tracy Haran. I'm a Sister of Providence, and I'm Associate Director of Education and Advocacy with the Keno Border Initiative. We are so excited to have this impressive group of panelists today for this conversation and really appreciate the participation. So WOLA and ourselves at Border Initiative are announcing the publication of a report denouncing into the void the dismantling of internal oversight and accountability at DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. And this report comes, we're almost a year to the day, it was March 21st of 2025, that we saw the dismantling of these essential oversight offices. And so we have a conversation today to talk about the impacts of that, this report, and the recommendations we have for reestablishing powerful oversight bodies that will keep these agencies in check. And so we appreciate your participation. To each of the panelists today, we'll go ahead and do quick introductions, and I will hand it over to Michelle.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Michelle Brunet. I am currently the executive director of Together and Free, a small NGO that works with families affected by immigration enforcement. Prior to this role, most recently, I was the Immigration Detention Ombudsman at OIDO, the Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman. Sorry for the repetition there, at DHS under the Biden administration.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carla Gilbride, and I am the Deputy Director of the Public Citizen Litigation Program. Public Citizen is a nonprofit that focuses on government transparency and accountability, and along with my co-counsel at Democracy Forward and the Robert and Ethel Kennedy Human Rights Center, I have been involved in litigation trying to halt the dismantling of these three offices that we're discussing today.
I'm Adam Isaacson. I work on migration and security with the Washington Office on Latin America, and thank all of you for joining this discussion, and it's always great to see my colleagues at the Keno Border Initiative again.
Hello, this is Juan Cuellar. I am the Director of Education and Advocacy for the Keno Border Initiative. And again, it's also a pleasure to be with these other panelists, and very excited to be able to launch this report today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again to each of our panelists for all the work that you've done and also for being present today. So I'm going to ask our first question to Michelle. If you could, for those of us who aren't as familiar with these oversight offices that were gutted last March, if you could just give us kind of a quick overview, what were these offices, what was their basic function, and what was your role in that work?
Sure. So I'll start with the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, since it's the largest of the three and the original one. The Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties was created really as an integral part of the Department of Homeland Security when it came to be in 2002. And that was very specifically because there was a lot of concern that a department focusing on Homeland Security and Americans inside of the United States that would be collecting data and enforcing laws needed some checks and balances to make sure that people's civil rights and civil liberties and the title of the organization not be violated. And so it was created as an essential component of the department. And they cover all employees and their actions under the Department of Homeland Security, which I will also emphasize is a very large department that covers much more than what we normally talk about DHS with, which is, immigration enforcement, CBP, ICE, and USCIS, but also covers TSA, FEMA, the Secret Service, and CISA, like a lot of terrorism investigations unit. So very, very broad. Also includes the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard. There are over 250,000 employees at the Department of Homeland Security. At least there used to be. I have to admit, I don't know what it is now that DOJ has had a hand on it. But so they cover a lot. The Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman was created fairly recently, only about 5 years ago, by Congress, specifically to focus on immigration detention and was intended to be complementary and not repetitive over CRCL. But I'll talk a little bit about that later because it can get kind of confusing. And then finally, the Office of the Ombudsman for CIS, for Citizenship and Immigration Services, covers that portion of immigration services, providing benefits to people under immigration laws. My role specifically was focused on the Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman. I was the ombudsman for the last 10 months of the Biden administration. Had a lot of experience before that working in the private sector on monitoring immigration detention for more years than I'd like to admit to, but a long, long time. And the Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman, I'll give a little bit more detail on since it's what I was most familiar with. Clearly, CRCL, who did investigations, they did individual investigations and also reports and oversight generally. And I will say for CRCL, a very large percentage of their work, even though proportionally I just described a really large organization within DHS that they were responsible for, the majority of the complaints and the issues that they found themselves investigating were with respect to ICE or CBP by far. And that was from the very earliest days of the office's existence. However, despite that, Congress found that there just wasn't enough oversight of immigration detention because there were just so many horrific things happening in detention, including people dying, medical complaints, litigation. It was constant. And so they decided that maybe an ombudsman's office would help. And so the ombudsman's office really focused less on investigations in the sense of finding blame and more on finding solutions and supporting immigrant detainees in their experience of being in detention. And so what I think is the most important piece of that was case management. We actually had people at facilities across the country able to go in person on a regular basis as much as possible and interact with detainees and take individual complaints. And in fact, the majority of complaints that OIDO received, and it was around 11,000 a year by the time we left, were based on individual interactions with people in detention. And they were able to respond very quickly within days, hopefully within 24 hours, but sometimes it took a little longer to get to that person and hear the details of their situation. We also had at OIDO an inspection, a detention oversight division that did do periodic inspections of facilities where we identified issues, made recommendations, and published reports. You can find those on the website. Those were very similar to the CRCL functions, but we focused on areas as follow-up or where there was gaps. And then finally, we had a policy division, which CRCL also had, where we aspired to identifying policy fixes for some of the chronic issues that were coming to us. And I can talk a little bit about that later if needed.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. That really helps to give us an overview of these three offices that were essentially gutted a year ago. And so, today, as we've lived a year with less oversight, I want to press it over to first Adam and then Juan to share what's in this report. So, as we're lifting up the consequences of gutting these offices, what are some of the top lines of the report? And, there is a lot of conversation happening already about needs for oversight. Some of the abuses, especially with ICE, have been really in the media, in the news. But what is this adding to that conversation? So I'll pass it to you, Anna.
Thank you, Tracy. Before I start, I should just mention that the report itself can be found at the short link using the bit.ly service, bit.ly. Do a slash after that and just type the words void report, and that will take you straight to the text of the report. Yeah, I mean, this is all happening at a time when DHS has vastly increased its capacity to arrest people, often quite aggressively. It has just about, not quite, but just about doubled its detention capacity, and just about, but not quite, it's about 50 or 60% more than usual increased its deportation capacity. And of course, anybody who reads the headlines over the last several months knows this, but that's the context in which the capacity to do effective oversight from within and to try to impact the organizational culture at DHS from within has been decimated. Now, yeah, Michelle very well described these agencies. I would add that their existence in all cases is mandated by law. They're in permanent law. They're in the US code. They just can't be abolished because the president says so. What happened a year ago this Saturday is that the Trump administration, they decided something that was sort of foreseen in the Project 2025 document. They decided that they would reduce these offices to their most minimal statutory expression. People who worked for CRCL and OIDO and then CSOM got a notice on March 21st of last year saying that they were all to be subject to a reduction in force, fired by the middle of May. Now, as a result of that, I mean, there was firings, there's been some hirings of contractors, but today, CRCL is 80% smaller than it was a year ago. Only about 30 people working, where there had been about 145, and most of those people are contractors. OIDO is 96% smaller, even as the detained population has nearly doubled. Now, elsewhere in DHS for oversight, there's still an Inspector General's office, which has been quite troubled. And in fact, the Inspector General, who himself was a Trump appointee, recently sent a memo to Congress saying that he is not getting the cooperation he needs and he's being stonewalled. And then there are offices of professional responsibility at CBP and ICE, which are small, although they did grow somewhat in recent years. So the firings really badly weakened an oversight and accountability system that was already very far from strong enough. OIDO, for instance, now has 5 employees to oversee a system of about 220 detention centers in ICE's network. You put all of those together before last March 21st, you had a ratio of about 1 oversight employee for every 126 DHS staff. The New York Police Department is about half that as far as internal affairs. They had more coverage of oversight than DHS does, and now that has been badly weakened. These offices could make recommendations. They couldn't necessarily enforce compliance with the recommendations, which was a problem. As the Keno Border Initiative can tell you, transparency about what happened after complaints was sometimes an issue. That said, these offices did play a very important role, even though they often were circumscribed. They had very dedicated, committed staff who were badly mistreated a year ago, and we're really feeling their absence now. They would be able to review or stop or at least slow down new policies that got introduced that might violate civil rights, privacy, or human rights. They were able to carry out inspections of detention facilities, including unannounced. Sometimes just the mere threat that there might be a complaint investigation was enough to deter abuse or influence behavior at ICE and CBP. Even if the investigation didn't result in discipline or ruin your career, it would still be a lot of red tape and perhaps some reputational harm. So that was a disincentive. And also just having people with deep knowledge of civil rights, civil liberties, which is sort of a squishy term that's not all that well defined always in US law or understood, being at the table, being present in internal policy discussions. Former CRCL employees we talked to assured us that there was an impact on the overall institutional culture at DHS that maybe wasn't that visible to those of us on the outside or those of us wondering what was happening to the complaints that were filed, that even as we were documenting abuses at the border, many bad things perhaps were not happening because of the cultural influence that those officers had on the inside informally. But then, yeah, they were decimated March through May of last year. Work on complaints stopped for months. Nobody there to review them. 2 months after the firings, the deputy director of CRCL testified that he was still working on a plan as to how to keep the agencies going. The CRCL has not issued any new recommendations. And as KBI can tell you, complaints result in just informed emails and no feedback. New complaints can only be submitted on the web portal. No phone calls, no regular mail, no email, only in English. Other languages are no longer accepted. So if you're in detention and think bad things are happening to you, you better hope your detention center has a tablet you can use, time that the guards give you time to use it, that you can somehow use it in your non-native language of English. And yeah, OIDO complaints have collapsed as the report documents over the last year. Investigations are often halted now when an individual leaves ICE custody, which is an incentive to deport people quickly. And required reporting to Congress is very badly behind. This is all in the report. Now, I don't need to read the past several months' headlines to you, but yeah, 13 people since January 3rd have died in ICE detention, which is a pace we've never seen before. We're getting constant reports of families being separated, including a new report this morning from Women's Refugee Commission and Physicians for Human Rights, documenting this happening inside the United States. Use of force issues obviously are making headlines. And then you've got all these new technologies like facial recognition, license plate readers, drones, unification of databases that should not be unified, raising enormous privacy concerns with little sense that anything is now happening within DHS to slow it down. And meanwhile, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act from last July puts about $170 billion plus more into ICE and CBP between now and the end of the Trump administration, which will pretty much triple ICE's enforcement and removal operations staff through a very rushed hiring process, adding 3,000 more Border Patrol agents with, again, there was no money in that bill for more oversight or accountability capacity. And the bill that the U.S. Congress has still not agreed on, this is not one of the controversial parts, but what was in that bill, it should be controversial, I think, but it's not part of the argument. The draft bill would actually cut CRCL's budget from about 43 million a year to 10 million a year, sorry, and zeroes out OIDO completely. So there is a lot to be done here to recover from this once there is an opportunity to do so.
Thanks so much, Adam, for that overview. And Juan, if you can share a little bit, what does this look like from the reality in Nogales?
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Adam. Well, in the report, we document a steep collapse in accountability. Under previous administrations, to give an example, some of our complaints were investigated. But in the past year, none of the 21 complaints that we have filed led to a formal investigation. And nearly half of these complaints from the past year were closed outright. Like after months of silence, we received generic emails informing us that the complaint had been received and that the case was being closed, which was quite surprising considering that some of the cases that we were filing merited some sort of investigation. At the same time, our interviews show that abuses are widespread. So 4 out of 5 recently deported people report to us that some sort of abuse during their arrest or detention happened to them. And many migrants now tell us that they are either fearful of retaliation, so they are not willing to file a complaint, or they simply believe that nothing will change. In the report, we also share that our process of filing complaints tries to be as complete as possible. So we not only carry out the filing of the complaint online as is requested by these offices, but we go a step further and also send an email to CRCL, OIDO, OPR, and OIG. And whenever possible, we seek local support from, let's say, the CBP Office of Professional Responsibility in Tucson to seek support in specific cases. When we seek for these local support help, we do see that officers there in this office, at least in Tucson, they are willing to help us. But these are just exceptions to the rule because the accountability system meant to support them also has been hollowed out. So as we have experienced it, the current complaint process is performative. It's just there, it exists, but it perpetrates impunity with its silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. And now I want to get into, Carla, if you can share with us about the litigation. So as we heard earlier, these oversight bodies are required by law. They're written in our permanent code. And so, dismantling these offices, really the allegation is that was an illegal act. And so, of course, you have been part of the litigation responding to that illegal act. So if you could share just as part of that litigation, what have been some of the most significant concerns that have come forward in that process? And what do you see as the implications for future work on reforming DHS oversight overall?
Thank you for the question, and thank you to KBI and WOLA for putting together this very important report documenting what's happened at these 3 offices. As I mentioned earlier, we filed litigation around the shutdown of the 3 oversight offices last April, so shortly after the March 21st announcement that all of these individuals were going to be fired through a reduction in force. And actually, I can't remember whether Adam said this in his overview, but one of the things that was particularly distressing about the way that that happened is that on the same date that the reductions in force were announced, all of the existing employees were also ordered to stop their work. So not to even notify people, that they were working on investigations, or if they had a scheduled visit to a detention center, they weren't allowed to follow up and explain, why they wouldn't be able to attend. It was just suddenly this stoppage of all of the work that was ongoing. And so we filed an action on behalf of 3 organizations that have interacted with these offices in the past: the Robert and Ethel Kennedy Human Rights Center, KHRC, which used to be known as Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, the Southern Border Communities Coalition, which is an umbrella group representing or coalition made up of many groups that are active or have constituents on the U.S.-Mexico border, and Urban Justice Center, which represents individuals with domestic violence matters, and many of whom are seeking immigration relief and who are interacting with the CISOM, the Citizenship and Immigration Services Ombudsman's Office. And so, all 3 of those groups have relied on these offices in the past, filed complaints, as KBI has described doing, and had those interactions weren't always perfect. They didn't always get a response, but those were effective mechanisms that they could use, on behalf of clients. In the case of KHRC, which represents people in detention, and Urban Justice Center, which represents people seeking immigration relief, like under the Violence Against Women Act. And sometimes those petitions get stalled, and the CIS Ombudsman's Office would be helpful in figuring out why those petitions were stalled, or how to, correct errors or get things moving again. And what we've learned, or what happened immediately when we filed the lawsuit, we sought a preliminary injunction. So, to stop the firings, because they hadn't yet occurred at that point. And DHS responded to our motion for preliminary injunction by saying, well, we're not actually going to shut down the offices. We're going to keep them going, but, make them more efficient. And that's when we started hearing about this plan for how the offices would be sort of reconfigured. And what we were told in court filings is that there would be dozens of people rehired. So instead of keeping some of the existing employees on staff, DHS was going to fire everyone, but then hire new people. But they could do that, very quickly, we were told, within a month. So this, litigation was going on in April and May, and we were told that as soon as June, we would have new people hired at all 3 offices. And that struck us as unlikely that things would actually go as quickly as the government promised. And we raised those concerns with the court, but the court did not grant the preliminary injunction, allowed us to continue the case, which we have done in the interim, but allowed the reduction in force to go forward. And so all of the employees at all 3 offices did lose their jobs on May 23rd. And unfortunately, our concern about the pace of rebuilding and the what sort of staffing was going to be provided, turned out to be well-founded. The numbers that were provided in these declarations of how many new employees the offices were going to hire turned out to be far less. Adam has mentioned some of those numbers. We have 5 people currently working at OIDO to inspect and interact with people detained at over 200 detention facilities, completely inadequate. And at CISOM, where there used to be over 40 employees, there are now 2 who are handling, tens of thousands of requests for assistance. And so what we're seeing as a result, and the other thing is that none of those hires were made until August. So there was a gap between March and August where no one was performing work at any of these 3 offices, as others have mentioned. During that same 5-month period, there was a huge escalation in DHS activity, in detention, in violations of people's constitutional rights, the sorts of things that these offices would be looking into if there were people working at them, and there was no one, literally operating, in any of these offices except a couple of political appointees who have other full-time jobs and were not really as the deposition testimony has shown, paying a lot of attention or spending a lot of time on these roles. They were just additional titles that they were given in addition to their main jobs. And so finally in August, we started to have a few people getting hired, but the results of what they've been able to do, and others have documented this, in Adam and Juan sort of reporting on the numbers. We have no recommendations coming out of CRCL. The complaint volume at OIDO, where we used to have 11,000 complaints a year, mostly because those case managers were in the facilities, talking to people directly, interacting with people directly. Now, when that is no longer happening and we just have these, fill out a web form in English, which you may or may not be able to access, the complaints have dropped to 280. So I don't exactly know off the top of my head what that percentage is, but like 1/50th of the previous number. So it's quite stark at the same time that we have record numbers of people in detention. And then, in terms of oversight, one of the other things that CRCL does, in addition to investigating specific complaints, is they're supposed to advise DHS and its various components on whether or not any of the things they're doing may violate civil rights and constitutional rights, and whether and review draft policies before they go into effect, kind of raise those red flags. And when we asked during depositions in this case whether that was happening, it was sort of, well, I've looked at a few things, I've made a couple small revisions. It doesn't sound like there is any sort of robust analysis or sort of raising of these concerns about civil rights violation ahead of time, being that canary in the coal mine to say, hey, maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe you shouldn't implement this policy, because, again, we don't have people in those roles now with the civil rights law expertise who would be in a position to do that. So those are some of the things that we've seen. One other point I wanted to make is that while it's true on the whole and for the most part that CRCL's recommendations are not binding, that they can, make suggestions, but the components within DHS are not obligated to follow them. There's one exception, which is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504, which prohibits discrimination based on disability. That is something that CRCL does have more binding enforcement authority to say if they investigate complaints of disability discrimination, and if they find a violation, then the component is required to take corrective action. But when we asked during depositions in this case if any violations of Section 504 have been found since March 21st, the answer was no. So, again, complaints may be investigated, but the results of those investigations, a lot of investigations are being closed, findings of no violation, and just not a lot of follow through. And the last thing I'd say is that in comparison to previous CRCL, when it was adequately or at least better staffed, and the office would investigate many of these violations themselves, now what has been reported to us is that the majority of the complaints, once CRCL receives them, they're referring the investigation back to the component itself. So if it's an investigation and an alleged violation of rights by ICE, they'll refer it back to ICE. And if it's a alleged violation by CBP, they'll refer it back to CBP, which, really calls into question whether there's any independent oversight happening on a lot of these allegations. So those are some of the things that we've seen. The case, is ongoing. We're waiting for the judge to rule on our motion for summary judgment, and we also are seeking a permanent injunction to restore some of the functions that have been decimated through the loss in staff and the loss in funding over the last year. And I'll leave it there. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about recommendations, so I'll stop at this point.
Thank you so much, Carla, and for all of your work putting that together. And I would just affirm that gap you mentioned from March to August, that we as well at the Keno Border Initiative, the migrants that we accompany who have filed complaints, we received not a single response or update on a case during that time as well. So we saw that as well. And I'll pass it to Juan to just share, we're hearing these numbers and some of the concrete impacts in these offices and how they're able to function. So if you could just give us an example of what does this actually mean for a person who files a complaint when we take it to the human level?
Sure. And I'll also start with just the context of the numbers that can be reflected in the personal experiences of so many migrants. So in our recent sample, 83% of people we interviewed after deportation reported at least one form of abuse in detention or during arrest, as I mentioned. And also, I mentioned that we had filed 21 complaints on behalf of migrants with DHS since January of 2025, and that not one investigation has been opened. For these 21 complaints, for 43% of those filed complaints, we have received generic responses. They take around 3 months to send these generic responses, and these emails simply indicate that the complaint has been received and the case has been closed. This gap between widespread abuse and a non-functioning complaint system creates a powerful deterrent. So people are reasonably concluding that reporting an abuse is actually risky and pointless. Risky because they fear receiving retaliation, and pointless because they realize that nothing will come out of it. And I want to start by sharing Arturo's story. So Arturo illustrates what it means, what I just said in practice. So after 27 years of living and working in Utah, he was a chef. He had a traffic stop for no apparent reason by a police officer. He was then taken to ICE, and 3 months later, he was deported. But during the 3 months that he was in the Florence Detention Center, he developed a severe stomach illness, likely from spoiled food or unsafe water. And when he asked for medical support, what he received was solitary confinement, or what he referred to it as el hoyo. And he was there for several days, and he learned that he couldn't complain even if he had a very bad pain in his stomach. And this is what we are seeing as a pattern. If they complain, they are threatened with isolation or loss of privileges. And in this, I also want to go deeper into another case, and this is the case of Judith. Judith her case shows the impunity, how much it reaches when somebody is in need of medical care. Judith crossed with a serious injury, requiring immediate surgery on her leg. U.S. doctors operated her, but Border Patrol discharged her and deported her to Nogales without any discharge paperwork. So there was no diagnosis, no instructions. So when she arrived in Mexico, the hospitals there were left guessing what surgery had been performed exactly and how to continue her treatment. So this, I want to highlight that, saying this contradicts DHS' own commitments on hospital discharge procedures. So this is not just a failure of bedside care, it's a failure of an agreed upon policy that existed precisely to avoid these types of situations. These procedures, which DHS agreed to adopt in July 2024 regarding discharge from hospital, were actually developed because CRCL received quite a few complaints from KBI, and throughout several years, they developed an investigation and came out on July 2024 with recommendations that DHS committed to implement. Unfortunately, CRCL didn't have back then and doesn't have now any power to require DHS to actually implement these commitments. However, this memo that we have also included in our report has become an important tool for advocates such as ourselves to point out to DHS their own rules when challenging dangerous practices. Yet in Judith's case, and this was last year in May 2025, Border Patrol appears to have ignored completely this guidance, sending her back to Mexico without any medical documentation despite her serious injury. Also in Judith's case, I want to highlight that we sent this situation to the office of Senator Mark Kelly. However, even he has found a wall when trying to reach CRCL for this. And I want to highlight also that before the recent cuts, we saw that the system, while limited, could sometimes deliver accountability. And I have just a quick example of a man that we call Jose Alfredo. And in 2022, he was assaulted and ran over by an all-terrain vehicle being managed by a Border Patrol agent. And unfortunately, he was deported without any medical documentation. And we filed complaints to CRCL and OPR, and these complaints led to an investigation, which after a year led to like a real solution for this problem with Jose Alfredo. He was provided, after being deported, a visa to come back to the US and be able to finish his treatment in the US, as in Mexico, he was not able to get any help. So that kind of outcome has not been possible under the current dismantled oversight regime, despite having very similar cases as Jose Alfredo's. So I just want to conclude by saying that we are now living with a complaint system that we call it in free fall. There's routine closures, opaque processes, and there seems to be a retaliatory climate that signals to migrants and to agents alike that abuse will almost never carry consequences. And this is something that we really want to highlight and find a solution for. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. We heard a couple of examples that you lifted up, and I believe with the Jose Alfredo case as well, that I'm familiar with, that there was actually disciplinary action against the agent, that was part of the follow-up to that complaint. So we know that there have been some examples of what happens when these offices are doing this investigation work and this oversight work. And Michelle, I wonder if you could just add any additional examples that would be helpful as we're thinking about what could this oversight actually look like to be effective, of the impact that these offices can have.
Sure. Thank you. And Juan already gave some really good examples, I think. And I'll just, again, reiterate that these offices in general, I think, were not nearly enough as they existed. And most of, if not all of the power they had or have even, is really soft power, what I refer to as soft power, right? But it doesn't mean that it's non-existent. It's sort of, the unfortunate part of it is it really depends on leadership, which makes it not really fully independent. But we were able to accomplish some things. So I think just adding some of the examples, I think one big piece again that's missing now completely from OIDO, since it's practically non-existent, is the case management piece, which these case managers really were able to make a difference on a daily basis in immigration detention facilities. And again, they weren't full-on investigations that necessarily resulted in a sort of formal finding, but they resolved issues on the spot. So for example, we had very common complaint was regarding medical care, as you've heard. That's not surprising based on the stories that Juan just told us. But often it was this, that they weren't being seen, right? That they complained about medical care and were sent to solitary or ignored or couldn't get an appointment. And so in those cases, if OIDO was contacted about that, we were able to intervene and immediately get an appointment for somebody with the medical office and resolve those issues. Sometimes the complaints regarding medical were that people thought they were getting the wrong medication, and we had medical staff on our team who could immediately look into their medical records, look at what they were being given, what it was supposed to be doing, and either confirm that it was the right medication but had a different name than what they were used to, or perhaps that it was the wrong medication. In some cases, they were able to identify that it was the wrong dosage or that something was not quite right with what they were receiving, and that could be reevaluated. We regularly visited people in solitary or segregation, and that was a huge, I think, just really had an enormous impact. We both were able to resolve cases in which people told us or felt that they were being unfairly placed in segregation, and in some cases had people removed and put back into the general population right away once we intervened, or at least be able to visit and make sure that people were receiving access to attorney calls and medical care and anything else they needed while they were in segregation. And in fact, I think just sometimes those visits, a lot of them, resulted in serious differences. And I'm just reminded of that today with the news of the really young man, 19 years old, who died by suicide in immigration custody most recently. That was a serious issue that OIDO was looking into, which sort of brings me to the next phase. Besides these individual responses, we were able to see patterns and address some of those issues. And so one of the things we were very concerned about was the use of segregation and its connections to mental health issues in custody, where, again, just being in detention is not good for people's health, both physical and mental. That was very clear based on our experiences. And so again, we're looking at ways to address that more systemically. And then I'll give another sort of systemic example. We got a lot of complaints at one facility, for example, about the food. Food complaints are very common. We could look into them. Maybe we could fix it for a day. And again, the authority sort of limited us. But in this case, it was really clear that something was going on because overwhelmingly people were complaining about being hungry and not having enough food, albeit bad. They still didn't have enough. And we were able to actually look into what was actually being served and discovered that they actually were not being fed the required calorie count for an average nutritional need for men. And they had mistakenly implemented a women's calorie count at this men's facility. And so that was immediately rectified. And, within a couple days, they were getting more food. So again, those are just some basic examples. We also were able to look into the tablets since they've come up a couple times today and found that there was no regulation or rules or policies around tablet use and their availability. And so they were really being used as a tool both to discipline people and within the facility, a power dynamic was developing within pods. And we sort of a good example of both not having enough authority, but having a little bit, is that we were able to encourage the use of new policies and drafted a sort of sample or recommended policy that we recommended be universally imposed. ICE did not impose that, but they took it under consideration and developed their own team to reanalyze what we had found. I'm sure that that's now gone to the winds, but it's an example of the kind of work that I think the agencies should be able to do to improve conditions.
Thank you, Michelle. Those are just some really concrete examples. I find that really helpful as we're having this conversation on a systemic level. And then what does this look like in the day-to-day? We've heard a lot of really great background on these offices, the impact that they had, the impact of dismantling the offices. And so, the question in a lot of our minds, I think, is what are we recommending? What are the specific concrete recommendations that we have? We know that there are some congressional staffers on today on this briefing, and we know there's a broader conversation happening about appropriations and funding. And so I'll first go to Carla and then Michelle and then Adam and Juan to just offer us one or two specific concrete recommendations that you have for members of Congress specifically, and for advocates reaching out to their members of Congress as we're looking at this issue. Carla?
Thank you. So several recommendations come to mind. One is around transparency. I think Juan had mentioned before that you received responses, but it wasn't always consistent. And so knowing what the status of complaints was, CRCL had in the past published several recommendation memos on their website, and most of those have now been removed. There's been some, back and forth in the litigation about what does need to be made public, and there is information in the statute or language in one of the statutes that applies to CRCL that talks about sharing with the public information about the office's activities, which we've pointed to in the litigation. But I think, one thing that in strengthening these offices, Congress could do is to make those public disclosure requirements about what has to be made public more, add some teeth to those or make them more robust. Another thing that people have mentioned is the recommendations being sort of optional. That obviously could be strengthened to require follow through on recommendations. And then one more that I'd just like to lift up what Michelle has said several times about, the importance and what was so valuable about OIDO was that the case managers were present in facilities consistently, maybe not every day, but frequently, and so got to know the staff, got to know how the facility worked, could make observations over time about whether things were improving, and could gain people's trust. And I think that made a huge difference in the effectiveness compared to in addition to just having completely inadequate staff, but this idea that people will come in, do an inspection and then leave, you don't have that on the ground presence. And again, I think that's something that is sort of The statute talks about having an accessible complaint process and providing, direct assistance to people in immigration detention, which we argue in the litigation is not happening now. So the offices are not functioning as Congress intended, but I think Congress could strengthen and, add details to what that providing of assistance requires, that having on the ground presence in the facilities really is necessary.
There you go, Meg.
Yes.
Thanks. So, yeah, Carla covered a lot of really critical pieces. I would just, again, emphasize not rebuilding. I mean, I think the immediate ask is reinstitute what we had, right? Get people back on board. But in the longer term, I think we really don't need to recreate a flawed system. And what would be great would be to actually come up with an oversight system that is maybe less overlapping and confusing and clearer in terms of directives, really clear independence and authority, really clearly articulated by Congress. We've seen already, I mean, a lot of this was articulated already, and this administration has just dismantled it. So I would say not letting them get away with that is really important. And the independence factor, I think, again, is critical and goes along with the transparency. I mean, and that would include independent legal counsel and not having to have things cleared through the head office or the central legal counsel at DHS. I know that's a little insider baseball, but I think specifically that would really help with the independence and with the transparency of being able to post information without having to have it reviewed by legal counsel, worried about whether it was going to somehow damage the department overall, which is sort of counterproductive to the whole point of having an independent body. And then finally, again, going to the case management piece or just presence and the workforce for these organizations, I would say in particular for something like looking at detention, rather than sort of looking at the budget as a whole as compared to the agency, I think it really needs to be tied somehow to the size of the immigration detention budget, including, CBP, ICE overall. When I was there, we calculated that the OIDO oversight budget was less than 1% of the immigration detention budget. Now I can't, now it's like minuscule, it's non-existent based on the huge increase in the number of beds. So tying it either to the budget or to the number of people that are being detained, because that's where it's really needed, right? And that would allow you to actually meet the need of following through with ensuring that the facilities are run with accountability and clearly. And then one final thing is giving them, in terms of the authority, having some control over contracts and weighing in on contracts would be really critical. Because one of the things we found consistently was facilities not complying with their contractual obligations and not being held accountable for that in any way.
Thanks, Michelle, for clarifying, especially those appropriations piece. And I'll pass it to Adam.
Sure. Just on congressional appropriations, I mean, the DHS bill is still wide open for negotiation. This has not been one of the central issues, but reversing the cuts that are proposed for those agencies would be important. Although right now, I mean, it is hard to say that they would be spent well with those agencies in their current form. But if Congress is going to exercise better oversight of these agencies, it would ultimately have to fund them to do their statutory duty. And again, there was a bill that was introduced by Representative Al Green and others in the past couple of Congresses called the Department of Homeland Security Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Authorization Act that would have, right now, current law says there will be a CRCL officer, but doesn't really spell out all the duties. I mean, it does, but not specifically enough. And it certainly doesn't spell out what the size of either office should be. Authorizing legislation that puts that in the U.S. Code is the best way to keep oversight from just swinging back and forth like a pendulum with every electoral result. So that's really important.
Thanks, Adam. And Juan, anything else you want to add to the recommendations that have already been to?
Yes, just to quickly add, and I'll just say that assuming that there will be staffing again for these agencies, and I clarify, like, not simply like political staffing that can happen, but technical staffing of these agencies from the ground, I think it would be most important in what I was saying before. When DHS accepts a recommendation, for example, in hospital discharge procedures, it should be required to implement it. report on compliance and face consequences when repeated violations show that it has not done so. So I just want to highlight that one because it's very specific for our job on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Juan. And I think my colleagues have done a great job of actually keeping up with the questions in the chat. I did notice there was a question, and Adam, you might be able to speak to this, about are these reports that we've been talking about that were all taken down from the Oversight Agency website, the recommendations and the memos, do those exist somewhere? And I believe that the answer is yes, that there is an NGO who did that work, but it's if you could add some detail.
Oh,
to
sure.
that.
I didn't see that question. I'll put it in the Q&A. But yes, the Project on Government Oversight rescued many of the reports. I think about 160 of them, and recommend mainly the recommendations. And I'll send the link to that in the Q&A.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have another question that asks if we considered expanding the mandate of other oversight bodies, such as correctional ombudsman or protection and advocacy agencies, to more clearly cover. So I guess thinking a little bit about how to do this work of oversight, they might place a federal agency, but could be alternative method of establishing oversight that's more independent. So I don't know if either Michelle or Carla, anyone really, wants to respond to that suggestion about another way that some of that oversight could be covered.
I mean, I think that's a good idea. It would have to be done through legislatively because there's no way it could be done like that. The access and all of that and the authority could be done otherwise, unless you had a very willing administration. But I think it's a good idea. You know, the OIG also sort of serves that purpose. It does cover these pieces. So again, thinking through making sure that there's coordination there would be important.
I was just going to say that members of Congress have been in some cases performing, these oversight functions, and there's currently litigation that's ongoing about members of Congress not being able to access detention facilities to perform oversight functions, which they're legislatively authorized to do. And I think, I agree that it would require new legislation, and I don't know how widespread that appetite would be, but I do think that the fact they're being kind of taxed with trying to do some of this themselves may make at least some members of Congress motivated to spread that duty to others. And I think that is a great idea, to find other groups like protection and advocacy, agencies who could do that in their state. If there's a facility co-located where they are, that they would have the authority to go in there and assess conditions, especially for issues affecting people with disabilities.
Yeah, it would have to come with budget because those organizations are already super tight with what they're covering. So I wouldn't want it to deter from what they're already overseeing, but it's a possibility. I think also creatively, there's other public organizations, non-governmental organizations that could step in and play that role if they were allowed access, which they used to be, right? That's another thing, not only do we no longer have the government oversight, but you used to be able to get access as an NGO, for example, to detention centers where you could do monitoring. I mean, I did that for many, many, many years. And that's how a lot of information is made public about conditions in custody that leads to improvements.
Thank you both for your responses. And, I think this other question about what an advocate can do right now to document. So, we discussed how the oversight agencies that really are charged with doing this work and that actually are mandated through congressional mandate, this isn't happening. So what can advocates do to document and expose these kinds of abuses and violations that are happening in detention or in encounters with federal law enforcement? I don't know if either Adam or Juan would want to speak to that a little bit more from the advocate side.
I can say a few things. It's kind of hard right now because you don't have access unless you're talking to somebody on the phone inside a detention center about what's happening, and then you can somehow convey that. And that's usually something that only like family members or attorneys can do. It's a black box quite often. One thing that obviously KBI does at their shelter is talk to people after they've been deported when it's too late to help them on the inside, but at least you're able to get some accountability, hopefully and more of an alarm about what happened on the inside. And KBI very systematically reports to Congress, in particular, about what they're hearing from people who, when they do intakes at the shelter. I'll give another plug, and I'll put it in the Q&A to the report that Women's Refugee Commission and Physicians for Human Rights just released today. They did something similar. They went to where the planes arrive in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, and were there for about a week and talked to people as they arrived and heard a lot about family separation, in particular with U.S.-born children and not having a chance to bring them with them. We had done that with WRC also back in July, and it's a very robust way to find out what's happening inside detention. But again, it's outside the United States. So this is a real huge transparency issue right now.
And just to add that, yes, it's much easier for us once they have been deported, but there are fortunately groups in the U.S. that do have visitation for these people that are in detention centers. So a way to help is by joining these groups. As many of the people that are being detained right now are or have been in the U.S. for quite a while, it's not necessary to speak Spanish. So people that only speak English can still seek these groups and see how they can join them and start visiting people that are being detained and hear the stories, and hopefully that way also elevate their voice even though they are inside.
Thanks, Juan. We are at time. I do want to just ask one more question and get a couple of responses from our panelists. I know that we've talked about the impacts we've seen over the past year, and we've also seen how former oversight employees have sounded alarms as well, both last year and just, I think, last week, about the impacts of the effective termination of these offices. But I'm curious from you all, we've heard the numbers. This is a huge reduction in force to actually hold these agents accountable. If we do nothing, what happens? What are the short or long-term impacts if Congress, if the current administration decide to do nothing to restore oversight?
Well, I'll jump in and say the first thing that I've been saying since day one, which is more people will die. More people will die in U.S. custody. And I think really this is just, again, a way in which this administration is, I was going to say slowly, but actually quite quickly, dismantling and undermining our humanity as a country and our position as a place where people have any sort of due process or civil liberties, right? If people are being taken into custody, there's no oversight and there's no accountability, what are we?
Just to add that this is happening at a moment when $38 billion is being spent over the course of the next year or so to open a network of warehouses, 8 of which will hold as many as 10,000 people in each one. Something that sounds like something that you only would see in like black and white movies from the 1940s is being built right now. And again, with almost none of the previous capacity to even be able to inspect or hear complaints about what's happening on the inside. It's kind of hard to convey what could happen without this capacity.
I would just say that given what's happening, given the ramp up in detention and the abuses of civil liberties, we need more oversight. And if we continue to have little to none, I think the abuses and people acting with impunity is only going to get worse.
Yes, in the same as Carla just said, like by sending the message that nothing will happen is saying that impunity is allowed, and like portraying that message in the long term can, as Michelle was saying, just create more deaths while they are detained and more situations of abuse, even if they are deported. It would be a terrible situation.
Well, thank you all again for your time. Thank you for all of those who asked questions and participated. And the report is now live, and As Adam was saying, you could go to bit.ly/void-report. And you can also find it on the WOLA website, and ask that you please share the report. We're happy to follow up. I know our office, all of the panelists here, KBI, WOLA, are happy to follow up with any journalists or congressional offices that want to talk more about this. Obviously, everyone here is very passionate about ensuring that this pattern of impunity and abuse without recourse ends, and that we can restore this oversight. So thank you all so much for your participation today. And this recording will be uploaded as well. So that's another resource that you can share with others as we're trying to bring more attention to this issue.